Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The 12 Days of Christmas Murders. Welcome to Mindful Musings, where we explore stories that illuminate the depths of human nature and the shadows that sometimes fall across even the most peaceful communities. I'm your host, William, and today I bring you a tale that unfolds during the season of goodwill, when ancient carols echo through village streets and gifts arrive wrapped in tradition and mystery. This is a story seen through the remarkable eyes of Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle wisdom has unravelled many a tangled thread in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. As Christmas approaches and snow begins to dust the hedgerows, someone has begun a deadly game of gift-giving, and Miss Marple must decipher the pattern before the final verse is sung. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The partridge arrives. The first week of December brought an early frost to St. Mary Mead, transforming the village into something from a Victorian Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, observing the morning light catching on ice crystals that decorated her garden like scattered diamonds. She was contemplating whether her late roses would survive another cold night when she noticed an unusual commotion at the vicarage across the lane. The Reverend Leonard Clement appeared at his front door, his expression caught somewhere between bewilderment and delight as he examined a package that had been left on his doorstep. Miss Marple's curiosity, honed by decades of observing human nature, stirred quietly within her. It was rather early for Christmas deliveries, and the vicar's evident surprise suggested this was no expected parcel. Later that morning, when Miss Marple called at the vicarage on the pretext of discussing the church flower rota, she found the vicar in his study with his wife Griselda, both gazing at the most extraordinary object. Perched elegantly in a miniature pear tree no more than 2 feet tall, sat a beautifully preserved partridge. The taxidermy was exquisite, capturing the bird in a moment of serene alertness, its plumage gleaming with lifelike detail. It arrived with the morning post, the vicar explained, though there was no postage, so someone must have delivered it by hand. There was just this card. He handed Miss Marple a small cream envelope. Inside, written in elegant calligraphy, were the words, "On the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a partridge in a pear tree." "How charming!" exclaimed Griselda, "though I cannot imagine who would send such a thing." "Leonard has been puzzling over it all morning, haven't you, dear?" The vicar nodded thoughtfully. "I've gone through my mental catalogue of parishioners, but I cannot think of anyone with such sophisticated tastes in taxidermy, or such a whimsical sense of gift-giving for that matter." Miss Marple examined the card carefully, noting the quality of the paper and the precise, almost professional quality of the calligraphy. There was something deliberate about it, something that spoke of planning and intention rather than spontaneous generosity. The pear tree itself was artificial but beautifully crafted, its branches adorned with small golden pears that caught the winter light streaming through the study window. "Perhaps it's the beginning of someone's 12 days of Christmas gift-giving," Griselda suggested with a laugh. "How delightful if you receive a different gift each day leading up to Christmas." The vicar smiled at his wife's enthusiasm, but Miss Marple noticed something flicker across his features, a shadow of something, uncertainty perhaps, or a memory stirring in the depths of his mind. She made her excuses shortly afterward, but the image of the partridge stayed with her as she walked home through the crisp December air. There was something about the gift that troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what it was. Perhaps it was simply the anonymity of it, or the peculiar choice of a preserved bird, rather than something more conventionally festive. The following morning brought fresh intrigue to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple learned of it from her maid, who had heard it from the baker's boy, who had seen it himself at the post office. 2 turtle doves, as beautifully preserved as the vicar's partridge, had been delivered to Mr. Emmett Fowler, the village postmaster. They sat in a decorative cage in the post office window, where they quickly became the talk of the village. Miss Marple made a point of visiting the post office that afternoon to post some Christmas cards. Mr. Fowler, a thin, nervous man in his late 50s, seemed less delighted with his gift than the vicar had been with his. The doves were undeniably beautiful, their plumage perfectly preserved, their poses suggesting they had been captured mid-flight. Like the partridge, they came with a card bearing a verse from the Christmas carol. "Very peculiar," Mr. Fowler muttered to Miss Marple as she examined the display. I cannot think who would send such things. Not that I'm ungrateful, mind you, but it's all rather odd, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed unusual. She noticed that Mr. Fowler's hands trembled slightly as he sorted the afternoon mail, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting troubled sleep. By the third day of Christmas, when 3 exquisitely preserved French hens arrived at the village school addressed to Miss Eleanor Pemberton, the headmistress, the entire village was buzzing with speculation. Miss Marple attended the village Christmas market that afternoon, where the mysterious gifts dominated every conversation. The hens, displayed in Miss Pemberton's office, were arranged in a charming tableau, each bird captured in a different pose. Standing by the mulled wine stall, Miss Marple overheard several theories. Some villagers thought it was a wealthy newcomer introducing themselves in a memorable fashion. Others suggested it was an elaborate marketing scheme for a local artisan. A few romantic souls believed it was a secret admirer expressing affection through the language of the old carol. But Miss Marple, sipping her mulled wine and watching the faces around her, noticed something else entirely. She noticed that the 3 recipients, the vicar, the postmaster, and the schoolteacher, seemed united not by delight but by a subtle undercurrent of unease. Each displayed their gift publicly, as social convention demanded, but each wore the same expression she had seen on the vicar's face that first morning, a shadow of something half-remembered, something that made them glance over their shoulders when they thought no one was watching. Chapter 2. A pattern emerges. The 4th day of Christmas brought calling birds to Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, the village magistrate, 4 beautiful specimens arranged on decorative branches in an ornate display case. Miss Marple observed their arrival while taking her morning constitutional past Mrs. Weatherby's impressive Georgian house on the High Street. The delivery van was unmarked, and the driver, when questioned by Mrs. Weatherby's housekeeper, claimed only to be following instructions from a customer who had paid in cash. Miss Marple made a point of calling on Mrs. Weatherby that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a charitable contribution to the church Christmas fund. She found the magistrate in her drawing room, the calling birds prominently displayed on a side table where guests could admire them. Mrs. Weatherby was a formidable woman in her early 60s, known for her stern judgments and inflexible interpretation of village regulations. Remarkable craftsmanship, Miss Marple observed, examining the birds closely. The preservation technique is quite sophisticated. I don't suppose there was any indication of where they came from. Mrs. Weatherby's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. None whatsoever. Just another card with that confounded carol verse. I've made inquiries, naturally. There are only 3 taxidermists within a 50-mile radius, and none of them recall producing such work or receiving such a commission. Miss Marple noted the magistrate's use of the word confounded rather than charming or delightful. There was clearly no pleasure in receiving these gifts, despite their obvious value and artistry. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's mind began to arrange the facts like pieces of a puzzle. 4 prominent village officials had now received gifts corresponding to the 12 days of Christmas Carol. 4 people who held positions of authority and respect in St. Mary Mead's small society. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, but her needles moved slowly as her mind worked. She thought about the recipients. The Reverend Clement, who had served St. Mary Mead for nearly 15 years. Mr. Fowler, postmaster for even longer. Miss Pemberton, who had been headmistress of the village school for over a decade. Mrs. Weatherby, magistrate for 12 years. What connected them besides their prominence in village life? The following morning, the 5th day of Christmas, Miss Marple was unsurprised to learn that 5 gold rings had been delivered to Dr. Haydock, the village physician. These were not preserved specimens like the previous gifts, but antique rings of considerable value, displayed in a velvet-lined box with the now familiar card. Dr. Haydock, a practical man of science, seemed more puzzled than pleased by the extravagant gift. When Miss Marple encountered him during his afternoon rounds, she seized the opportunity to discuss the curious situation. Dr. Haydock confided his unease as they stood in the weak December sunshine outside the chemist's shop. It's not natural, Miss Marple. Gifts should come from known benefactors, not anonymous sources. It makes one wonder what obligation is being created, what expectation is being established. Miss Marple found this perspective illuminating. Dr. Haydock had immediately perceived what the others had felt but perhaps not articulated, that these gifts carried an implicit weight, a sense of obligation or indebtedness that was fundamentally unsettling. She returned home and retrieved her diary from 12 years past, having remembered something that had been nagging at the edges of her consciousness. There, in her neat handwriting from December of 1943, she found what she had been seeking: a brief entry about a tragedy that had shaken St. Mary Mead during the previous Christmas season. Mary Partridge, a young woman of 20, found dead in the woods near Gossington Hall. The coroner had ruled it suicide, though the circumstances had been whispered about for months afterward. Miss Marple remembered the girl vaguely, a quiet, lovely young woman who had worked as a housemaid for several village families. The 6th day of Christmas arrived with heavy clouds promising snow. Miss Marple woke early, troubled by dreams she could not quite remember. She was taking her breakfast when her maid brought news that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Thomas Wickham, the farmer who owned Meadowsweet Farm on the edge of the village, had been found dead in his barn, apparently trampled by his own geese. By mid-morning, Dr. Haydock had examined the body and Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham with several constables. Miss Marple, whose cottage provided an excellent view of the comings and goings on the main road, observed the unusual activity with growing concern. When her friend, the vicar's wife, Griselda, called on her that afternoon, the truth emerged. "It wasn't an accident," Griselda whispered, "though Leonard told me I shouldn't repeat it." Dr. Haydock told him in confidence that Thomas was already dead when he was placed in the barn. Poisoned, they think. And Jane, this is the truly horrible part. 6 geese were delivered to him yesterday. 6 geese are laying, just like the carol. They found the card, still in his pocket. Mr. Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle suddenly shift, forming a darker, more sinister pattern than she had imagined. This was not whimsical gift-giving or even elaborate harassment. This was something far more calculated and infinitely more dangerous. Someone was working through the 12 days of Christmas Carol, and the 6th recipient had been murdered. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in careful thought, reviewing everything she knew about Thomas Wickham. He had been a prosperous farmer, a widower for many years, known for his shrewd business dealings and somewhat harsh treatment of his workers. He had served on the parish council and had been, Miss Marple recalled, one of the witnesses at the inquest into Mary Partridge's death 12 years ago. The connection crystallized in her mind with sudden, terrible clarity. She retrieved her diary again and cross-referenced the names. The Reverend Clement had presided over the inquest and had subsequently refused Mary Partridge a church burial, citing the sin of suicide. Mr. Fowler, as postmaster, had been the primary source of gossip about Mary's circumstances, spreading rumours throughout the village. Miss Pemberton had expelled Mary from her position as a classroom assistant shortly before her death. Mrs. Weatherby, as magistrate, had overseen the legal proceedings and had been particularly harsh in her judgments about Mary's character. Dr. Haydock had signed the death certificate, and Thomas Wickham had testified that he had seen Mary in a distressed state in the woods the day she died, implying that her mental state was disturbed. 6 people, 6 gifts, and 1 death. But the carol had 12 verses, which meant 6 more recipients remained to be identified, and 6 more potential victims. Miss Marple reached for her telephone with hands that trembled slightly. She needed to speak with Inspector Slack immediately, regardless of his usual dismissive attitude toward what he termed her interference. The pattern was clear now, and time was running short. Chapter 3. The 7th Swan. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with his characteristic blend of scepticism and grudging respect. He was a thick-set man with a perpetually suspicious expression, as though he suspected even the weather of criminal intent. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where she had prepared a detailed timeline of events written in her precise handwriting. "Now, Miss Marple," the inspector began, settling heavily into her best chair, "I've come because Dr. Haydock insisted, though I must say this all seems rather fanciful. You're suggesting these Christmas gifts are connected to a suicide from over a decade ago." She poured tea with steady hands before responding. "Not a suicide, Inspector. I believe Mary Partridge was murdered, and I believe the same person who killed her is now systematically eliminating everyone who helped cover up that crime." Inspector Slack's expression shifted from skepticism to interest as Miss Marple laid out her evidence. She had compiled a list of everyone involved in Mary Partridge's case, cross-referencing it with the gift recipients. The correlation was undeniable. Each person had played a role in either Mary's death or the subsequent cover-up, and each was receiving a gift corresponding to their position in a predetermined sequence. The inspector studied her timeline, his thick fingers tracing the connections. But who would want revenge after all these years? Mary Partridge had no family, as I recall. Her parents had died some years before, and she was alone in the world. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not quite alone, Inspector. I've been reviewing the parish records, and I discovered that Mary had a younger sister, Sarah, who was placed in an orphanage after their parents' death. Sarah would have been only 10 years old when Mary died. Now she would be 22. Before Inspector Slack could respond, there was an urgent knocking at Miss Marple's door. Her maid appeared, breathless and pale, with news that sent both Inspector Slack and Miss Marple hurrying toward the high street. Dr. Haydock's body had been discovered in his own fish pond behind his surgery, and witnesses reported that 7 magnificent swans had been delivered to his home just that morning. The scene at Dr. Haydock's residence was one of controlled chaos. The good doctor lay at the bottom of his ornamental pond, visible through the clear water, his eyes staring upward at nothing. 7 preserved swans mounted on a wheeled platform stood near the pond's edge like silent witnesses to the tragedy. The card lay on the platform. 7 swans are swimming. This changes everything, Inspector Slack muttered, staring at the swans with an expression of dawning horror. If you're right, Miss Marple, and there are 12 intended victims, we have 5 more people in mortal danger. We need to identify them immediately and provide protection. Miss Marple had already compiled the list. Based on the inquest records and village history, the remaining recipients would likely be Mr. Harold Bassett, the village solicitor who had handled Mary's meagre estate, Mrs. Judith Crane, who had been Mary's employer and had dismissed her without references, Colonel Melchett, the chief constable who had overseen the investigation, Mr. Geoffrey Price, a young man who had courted Mary and then publicly rejected her, and Sir Henry Clithering, who as magistrate at the time had signed off on the inquest findings. Inspector Slack immediately dispatched constables to warn each person and arrange police protection. But Miss Marple knew that protection alone would not solve the puzzle. They needed to identify the killer and understand how the murders were being accomplished. The precision of the deaths suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of each victim's routine and vulnerabilities. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her early 20s appeared at her door, asking to speak with her privately. She introduced herself as Sarah Marsh, though Miss Marple immediately recognized the surname as Mary Partridge's mother's maiden name. The young woman was pale and composed, with dark hair and remarkable grey eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "I heard you were asking questions about my sister," Sarah said quietly once they were seated. "I wanted you to hear the truth from me." Miss Marple poured tea and waited. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most effective interview technique. "Mary didn't kill herself," Sarah continued. "She was pregnant, and the father was a married man, someone prominent in the village. When she told him, he panicked. He arranged to meet her in the woods and gave her poison disguised as medicine to help with her distress. Then he made it look like suicide and convinced everyone that she was mentally unstable." "Who was the father?" Miss Marple asked gently. Sarah's hands tightened around her teacup. "That's what I've spent 12 years trying to discover. I was just a child when it happened, but I never believed the suicide story. I've been working as a craftswoman, making decorative items and selling them at markets throughout the region. It gave me an excuse to return to St. Mary Mead and investigate without arousing suspicion." Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. "You make decorative items, including preserved birds and ornamental displays." Sarah met her gaze steadily. "I learned taxidermy and craft work specifically so I could create the gifts. I wanted each person who helped cover up Mary's murder to know they were being watched, to feel fear the way Mary must have felt fear in her final moments. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I haven't killed anyone. The gifts were meant to frighten them into confessing, not to die." The claim seemed sincere, but Miss Marple knew that sincerity could be feigned. If Sarah was telling the truth, then someone else was using her gift-giving campaign as cover for murder. If she was lying, then she was a remarkably accomplished actress. Either way, the remaining 5 recipients were in grave danger, and the 12th day of Christmas was drawing inexorably closer. Chapter 4. 8 Maids A-Milking. The morning after Dr. Haydock's death brought fresh snow to St. Mary Mead, transforming the village into a Christmas scene that seemed grotesquely at odds with the fear now permeating its streets. Miss Marple rose early and found Inspector Slack already at her door, his face grey with exhaustion and frustration. "Another one," he said without preamble. "Mr. Harold Bassett, the solicitor, found dead in his office at midnight by his clerk. 8 porcelain milkmaids were arranged on his desk, and the card was pinned to his chest." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. 3 murders in as many days suggested an escalating urgency on the killer's part. She dressed quickly and accompanied Inspector Slack to Bassett's office in the village square, where a crowd had already gathered despite the early hour. The scene inside the solicitor's office was meticulously arranged. Harold Bassett sat at his desk, his head resting on a stack of legal documents as though he had simply fallen asleep at work. 8 beautifully crafted porcelain figurines of milkmaids surrounded him, each one unique and clearly valuable. The card read, 8 Maids A-Milking, but it was the documents beneath Bassett's head that caught Miss Marple's attention. "These are copies of Mary Partridge's will and estate papers," she observed, carefully examining them without touching. "And here, this appears to be correspondence regarding her dismissal from Mrs. Crane's employment." Inspector Slack, I believe Mr. Bassett knew more about Mary's death than he revealed at the inquest. The inspector nodded grimly. "We found his diary in the desk drawer. He'd been keeping detailed notes about the Partridge case for years. Apparently Mary came to him shortly before her death and told him she was being blackmailed by someone who knew about her pregnancy. She wanted legal advice, but was too frightened to name the blackmailer. Before Miss Marple could respond, a constable burst into the office with urgent news. They had located Sarah Marsh at her lodgings above the bakery and brought her in for questioning. The young woman's room had been found to contain detailed files on each of the gift recipients, including photographs, schedules, and personal information that suggested extensive surveillance. Miss Marple insisted on being present during the interview. Sarah sat in the small room at the police station, her grey eyes defiant but tinged with fear. She maintained her innocence with quiet intensity, explaining that her research had been necessary to identify everyone involved in her sister's death, but that she had no knowledge of the murders. "I created the gifts to make them uncomfortable, to remind them of what they'd done," Sarah repeated. "But I never intended to kill anyone. I wanted them to confess publicly to clear Mary's name and reveal the truth about who murdered her." Inspector Slack was sceptical. "Then how do you explain that each victim received your crafts just before their death? How do you explain your detailed surveillance of their movements and habits?" Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know. Someone must have known about my plan and used it for their own purposes. Or perhaps," Miss Marple interjected quietly, "someone wanted us to believe Sarah was responsible, thereby obscuring their own involvement." The inspector turned to her with surprise. "You think she's being framed?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we need to consider who benefits from these murders. Sarah gains nothing except the burden of suspicion, but someone else, someone who was actually responsible for Mary's death, might be eliminating witnesses to protect themselves." Commotion outside interrupted their discussion. Mrs. Judith Crane, Mary's former employer and the 9th name on Miss Marple's list, had arrived at the police station demanding protection. She was a handsome woman in her 60s, imperiously dressed and clearly accustomed to authority, but fear had stripped away her usual confidence. "I've received a package," she announced, her voice shaking. 9 ladies dancing, 9 porcelain figurines arranged in a music box. Someone left it on my doorstep this morning with that dreadful card. "Inspector Slack, I demand immediate police protection." The inspector assured her that constables would be assigned to guard her home, but Miss Marple noticed something curious in Mrs. Crane's manner. Her fear seemed performative somehow, as though she were playing a role rather than genuinely experiencing terror. It was a small observation, but Miss Marple had learned over many years that small observations often proved crucial. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village library, where she spent several hours reviewing old newspapers from 12 years ago. The librarian, Miss Bunting, was happy to assist, pulling bound volumes of the local gazette from the archives. Miss Marple read through every article about Mary Partridge's death, taking careful notes. One detail caught her attention. In a brief society column from 2 weeks before Mary's death, there was mention of a Christmas party at Mrs. Crane's residence where Mary had been serving as a temporary maid. The guest list included most of the prominent names in the village, including several of the gift recipients. More intriguingly, there was a photograph showing the guests, and in the background, barely visible, was Mary herself, serving drinks to the assembled company. Miss Marple borrowed the newspaper volume and took it to the police station, where Inspector Slack was coordinating protection for the remaining potential victims. She pointed out the photograph to him, and together they studied the faces captured in that moment 12 years ago. There was something about the composition of the scene, about the way certain guests were positioned in relation to Mary, that suggested familiarity beyond that of servant and master. Inspector Slack sent constables to re-interview everyone present at that party. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and made a telephone call to her nephew Raymond in London. He had connections in theatrical circles and access to resources that might prove useful. She asked him to research Sarah Marsh's background, particularly her movements over the past year, and any associates who might have helped her create the elaborate gifts. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. The pattern was becoming clearer, but crucial pieces remained missing. Who was the father of Mary's child? Who had actually killed her? And most urgently, who was now using Sarah's gift-giving campaign as cover for a series of carefully planned murders? The 12 days of Christmas were passing swiftly, and with each day, the danger grew more acute. Chapter 5. The 10th Lord Leaping. The 9th day of Christmas passed without incident, though the entire village remained on edge. Mrs. Judith Crane stayed under police protection, her home surrounded by constables who watched for any sign of threat. Miss Marple used the quiet day to pursue her own investigations, making a series of calls on village residents who had lived in St. Mary Mead during Mary Partridge's time. One such visit took her to the cottage of Mrs. Florence Reed, an elderly woman who had worked as a cook for several prominent families before retiring. Mrs. Reed received Miss Marple warmly, serving tea and reminiscing about the old days. When the conversation turned to Mary Partridge, her expression grew sombre. "Such a sweet girl," Mrs. Reed said, shaking her head. "Too trusting by half. She fell in love with the wrong man, and it destroyed her." "Did you know who the man was?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Reed hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and honesty. "I suspected, but I had no proof. There were rumours, of course. Some said it was young Mr. Price, the banker's son. Others whispered about Colonel Melchett himself. But I always thought it was someone else entirely, someone no one would have suspected." Before Mrs. Reed could elaborate, they were interrupted by the sound of church bells tolling urgently. Miss Marple recognised the pattern immediately, the alarm signal that meant another tragedy had occurred. She hurried toward the village square, where a crowd was gathering outside the offices of Price & Sons, the village bank. Geoffrey Price, now a prosperous banker in his early 40s, had been found dead in his office. 10 antique toy soldiers, representing lords a-leaping, were arranged on his desk in military formation. The card bore the expected verse, 10 lords a-leaping. But, unlike the previous murders, this death appeared to be a suicide. A note in Price's handwriting confessed to having an affair with Mary Partridge 12 years ago, and expressed remorse for his treatment of her. Inspector Slack was inclined to accept the suicide explanation, seeing it as a break in the case. Perhaps the guilt finally became too much for him. Perhaps he killed the others to silence them before taking his own life. But Miss Marple was not convinced. She examined the note carefully, noting the precise handwriting and formal phrasing that seemed oddly at variance with the emotional content. "Inspector," she said quietly, "does this sound like a man overcome with guilt to you? The language is remarkably controlled, almost legal in its construction. And there's something else." She pointed to the toy soldiers. "These are not porcelain or preserved specimens like the other gifts. They're antique painted tin, quite valuable, but different in character from everything that came before." The inspector frowned. "You think someone made it look like suicide?" "I think we should not be too hasty in our conclusions," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. She turned to examine the office more carefully, her sharp eyes noting details that others might miss. There were photographs on Price's desk showing him with his wife and children, all smiling broadly. His appointment calendar showed meetings scheduled for the coming week. These did not seem like the preparations of a man planning to end his life. That evening, Miss Marple received a telephone call from her nephew Raymond in London. His research into Sarah Marsh had yielded interesting results. The young woman had indeed spent 12 years learning various crafts, including taxidermy, porcelain work, and decorative arts. But more significantly, she had spent 6 months working as an assistant to a private investigator, learning surveillance techniques and document research. She was searching for her sister's killer, Raymond explained. The investigator she worked with specialized in cold cases. According to him, Sarah was methodical, patient, and determined, but she had a strict moral code. He couldn't imagine her committing murder, though he acknowledged she might bend other rules in pursuit of justice. This information aligned with Miss Marple's own assessment of Sarah's character. The young woman remained in police custody, though no formal charges had been filed due to lack of evidence directly linking her to the murders. Miss Marple visited her the following morning, finding her pale but composed in the small cell at the police station. "I need to ask you something," Miss Marple began without preamble. "When you were researching your sister's death, did you discover who the father of her child was?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I believe it was Colonel Melchett. I found letters Mary had written but never sent, hidden in her old Bible at the orphanage. They were love letters, addressed only to M, but the details matched Colonel Melchett's circumstances. He was married, powerful, and terrified of scandal." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "Did you confront him?" "No," Sarah admitted. "I was still gathering evidence. I wanted to be certain before making accusations. Colonel Melchett was the 11th name on Miss Marple's list, which meant he would be receiving his gift soon if the pattern continued." She left the police station and immediately sought out Inspector Slack. "We need to speak with Colonel Melchett urgently," she told him. "I believe he may be the key to understanding everything that has happened." The inspector agreed, and together they drove to the Colonel's impressive country house on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. But when they arrived, they found the household in turmoil. Colonel Melchett had received his gift that morning, 11 pipers piping in the form of antique musical instruments arranged in his study, and had immediately gone into seclusion, refusing to see anyone or speak with the police. His wife, Lady Melchett, received them in the drawing room, her refined features drawn with worry. "He's locked himself in his study. He won't eat, won't speak. When the package arrived this morning, he went absolutely white and ordered everyone away. I've never seen him so frightened." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. The Colonel's reaction suggested guilt, but whether it was guilt for Mary's murder or for some other involvement remained unclear. As they stood in the drawing room, uncertain how to proceed, a shot rang out from somewhere in the house. They rushed toward the study where servants were already pounding on the locked door. Inspector Slack ordered it broken down, and they found Colonel Melchett slumped in his chair, a revolver in his hand and a note on his desk. But it was what Miss Marple saw beyond the body that made her suddenly understand the truth. The 11 pipers were arranged on a shelf, and beside them sat a 12th gift, 12 drummers drumming, that had not been delivered to anyone else. The final piece of the carol, present in the Colonel's study before the pattern should have been complete. Chapter 6. The Truth About Mary. The apparent suicide of Colonel Melchett sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that evening. Inspector Slack, exhausted and overwhelmed, was inclined to close the case. The Colonel's note confessed to having had an affair with Mary Partridge and to providing her with poison disguised as medicine for her distress. The deaths of the other victims, he claimed, were his attempts to silence anyone who might have known or suspected his involvement. But Miss Marple remained in the Colonel's study long after his body had been removed, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of the scene. There were elements that troubled her, small inconsistencies that nagged at her trained perceptions. The note was typed rather than handwritten, unusual for such a personal confession. The positioning of the revolver seemed awkward for a self-inflicted wound, and most significantly, there was that 12th gift, the drummers that should not yet have been delivered. "Inspector Slack," she said quietly, "may I see Colonel Melchett's note again?" The inspector handed it to her, and she read it carefully. "This confession is remarkably comprehensive. It describes events in great detail and acknowledges specific facts about the previous murders, perhaps too comprehensive for a man supposedly overcome with sudden remorse. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That someone is trying very hard to make us believe this case is closed," she replied. but I believe we need to examine Lady Melchett's whereabouts today, and I think we should search the house more thoroughly." The inspector sighed but agreed to follow her suggestions. Lady Melchett claimed to have been visiting a friend in Much Benham during the afternoon, returning home just before the shot was heard. Her alibi seemed solid, but Miss Marple noticed something interesting. When the police searched the house, they found a small workshop in the attic filled with craft supplies, taxidermy tools, and partially completed decorative pieces. Lady Melchett appeared genuinely shocked when confronted with the discovery. "I have no idea what those things are doing there. I never go into the attic." "My husband must have," she trailed off, confusion evident on her face. Miss Marple examined the workshop carefully. The tools and materials matched those used to create the gifts, but they seemed recently placed rather than long established. There was dust on the floor around the workbench, but not underneath it, suggesting the table had been moved into position recently. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat by the fire, reviewing everything she knew. She had her nephew Raymond's research on Sarah Marsh, Mrs. Reed's hints about the identity of Mary's lover, the evidence from the Colonel's study, and her own observations accumulated over many years of watching human nature in action. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to see a different pattern emerging. The following morning, she called on Mrs. Judith Crane, who remained under police protection at her home. The older woman received her reluctantly, her earlier fear now replaced by a brittle hostility. "I suppose you've come to gloat, Miss Marple, now that the Colonel has confessed and this dreadful business is over." "Not quite over, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied gently. "You see, I've been thinking about that Christmas party 12 years ago, the one mentioned in the newspaper. You hosted it, and Mary Partridge was working as a temporary maid that evening. Several witnesses have mentioned seeing her in private conversation with someone that night, someone who later followed her out into the garden." Mrs. Crane's face paled slightly. "I don't recall any such incident. It was a large party. I couldn't possibly keep track of every guest's movements." "But you do recall Mary leaving your employment shortly afterward," Miss Marple continued, "and you refused to provide her with a reference, which made it very difficult for her to find other work." "Why was that, Mrs. Crane?" The older woman's composure cracked slightly. "She was unsuitable. There were rumours about her moral character. I couldn't risk my reputation by endorsing someone of questionable virtue." "Yet those rumours only began circulating after she left your employment," Miss Marple observed. "In fact, they began with very specific stories that could only have come from someone in your household. Mrs. Crane, I believe you knew who the father of Mary's child was, and I believe you helped spread the rumours to protect that person's reputation." Mrs. Crane stood abruptly. "This interview is over. I won't be subjected to these accusations in my own home." Miss Marple rose as well, her voice remaining gentle but firm. "I will leave, but I want you to know that I believe Mary Partridge was murdered, and I believe the person who killed her is still alive, and has been systematically eliminating anyone who might expose the truth. If you're protecting someone, Mrs. Crane, you may be the next victim rather than merely a potential one." The older woman's hand trembled as she reached for the bell to summon her maid. As Miss Marple departed, she noticed something curious. Arranged on a side table in the hallway were 9 porcelain ladies dancing, the gift Mrs. Crane had reported receiving. But one of the figurines had a small chip on its base that Miss Marple recognized. She had seen that exact figurine before, in a photograph from an estate sale listing in an old newspaper, an estate sale that Mrs. Crane herself had organized 5 years ago. The implication was staggering. Mrs. Crane had not received the gift from an anonymous sender. She had created it herself from pieces in her own collection, which meant that Mrs. Crane was either working with the killer or was the killer herself, creating an elaborate deception to divert suspicion. But why? And how did it connect to Mary Partridge's death 12 years ago? Miss Marple returned home and immediately telephoned Inspector Slack. "I need you to research something for me," she said urgently. "Find out who inherited Colonel Melchett's estate and also investigate Mrs. Crane's finances from 12 years ago, around the time of Mary Partridge's death." The inspector agreed, though he sounded sceptical about reopening what he considered a closed case. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Lady Melchett, her usual composure completely shattered. She had been weeping, and her hands shook as Miss Marple guided her to a chair and prepared tea. "I need to tell someone the truth," Lady Melchett said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't bear the lies any more. My husband didn't kill himself, and he didn't kill those other people. He couldn't have. He was with me the entire afternoon before he died." Miss Marple waited patiently for the woman to compose herself. Lady Melchett drew a shuddering breath before continuing. "My husband was having an affair with Mary Partridge. I knew about it at the time, but he wasn't the father of her child. He was sterile, you see, from an illness in his youth. He could never have children. We adopted our daughter, though we never told anyone. When Mary became pregnant, he ended the affair because he knew the child couldn't be his." "Then who was the father?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lady Melchett's face twisted with anguish. "I don't know, but I believe Mary knew something else, something that made her dangerous to someone. The day before she died, she came to see me. She was terrified. She said she had discovered something terrible about someone we knew, something that could destroy them. She wanted my help, but I sent her away. I was angry about the affair and too proud to listen. By the next day, she was dead." Miss Marple felt the pieces suddenly shifting into a new configuration. Mary had discovered something, a secret unrelated to her pregnancy but equally dangerous to someone in the village. Someone had killed her to protect that secret and made it look like suicide. Everyone had assumed her death was connected to her pregnancy and the shame of it. But what if that had been a convenient misdirection? "What happened after Mary died?" Miss Marple asked. "Did anyone benefit from her death in an unexpected way?" Lady Melchett considered the question. Mrs. Crane purchased Mary's cottage at auction. It was sold to settle Mary's debts. Mrs. Crane got it for a remarkably low price because there were rumours that it was unlucky. She sold it years later for 10 times it's what she paid. Miss Marple's mind raced. A cottage purchased cheaply and sold profitably. But why would that matter enough to commit murder? Unless there was something in the cottage itself, something Mary had found or hidden there, something worth killing to protect. She thanked Lady Melchett for her honesty and promised to do everything she could to clear the Colonel's name. That evening, Miss Marple made a call to the Land Registry Office and requested records for Mary Partridge's former cottage. The trail led her to a discovery that finally made everything clear. The cottage had originally belonged to Mrs. Crane's late husband, who had sold it to Mary for a nominal sum just months before his death. His will, which Miss Marple obtained a copy of, had been changed shortly before he died, leaving everything to his wife rather than to his children from a previous marriage. The pattern was complete. Mrs. Crane had been having an affair with her own husband's business partner, a relationship that would have cost her everything if discovered during her husband's lifetime. Mary, working in the house, must have found evidence of the affair. Mrs. Crane had murdered her husband and made it look like a natural death, then changed his will to inherit his fortune. But Mary had discovered the truth, perhaps finding poison in the house or overhearing incriminating conversations. When Mary became pregnant and desperate, she had tried to blackmail Mrs. Crane, and Mrs. Crane had killed her, making it look like suicide and using Mary's pregnancy as the assumed motive. Now, 12 years later, Sarah Marsh's gift-giving campaign had threatened to expose everything. Mrs. Crane had used Sarah's plan as cover, murdering everyone who might have remembered details that could connect her to Mary's death, and she had arranged Colonel Melchett's apparent suicide to close the case permanently, planting evidence in his study and workshop to frame him posthumously. Chapter 7. The 12th day approaches. Miss Marple sat at her desk, organising her evidence with methodical precision. She had built a circumstantial case against Mrs. Judith Crane, but circumstantial evidence alone might not be sufficient to convince Inspector Slack or secure a conviction. She needed proof, something concrete that would demonstrate Mrs. Crane's guilt beyond doubt. The 12th day of Christmas was approaching, and Miss Marple knew that the 12th gift would be crucial. According to the carol, the final verse was 12 drummers drumming. Miss Marple had seen a set of 12 drummers in Colonel Melchett's study, but who was the intended recipient of the 12th gift in the original plan? She reviewed her list of people involved in Mary Partridge's case. Most were now dead, either murdered or apparently driven to suicide. But one name remained that had not yet received a gift, Sir Henry Clithering, the former magistrate who had signed off on the inquest findings. Sir Henry had retired from his position years ago and now lived quietly in London, visiting St. Mary Mead only occasionally. Miss Marple telephoned him immediately and found him at his club. She explained the situation carefully, detailing the pattern of murders and her suspicions about Mrs. Crane. Sir Henry listened with the careful attention of a man trained to evaluate evidence. "I remember the Partridge case," he said thoughtfully. "There were aspects of it that troubled me at the time, but Mrs. Crane was most insistent that the suicide verdict was correct. She claimed to have personal knowledge of Mary's mental state and provided testimony that swayed the inquest. I deferred to her judgment because she seemed so certain and so concerned for the family's reputation. Did Mrs. Crane have any particular reason to want the verdict to be suicide rather than murder?" Miss Marple asked. Sir Henry paused before responding. "Now that you mention it, she did seem unusually invested in the outcome. She argued strongly against a more thorough investigation, claiming it would only cause more pain and scandal. At the time, I thought she was being considerate, but perhaps she had other motives." Miss Marple asked Sir Henry to return to St. Mary Mead immediately, and he agreed, sensing the urgency in her voice. She then contacted Inspector Slack and arranged for a meeting at her cottage that evening. She also sent a carefully worded note to Mrs. Crane, inviting her to tea the following afternoon to discuss important information about Mary Partridge's case. Inspector Slack arrived that evening looking harried and doubtful. "Miss Marple, I hope you have something substantial. The Chief Constable is pressuring me to close this case and accept Colonel Melchett's confession as genuine." Miss Marple served him tea and laid out her evidence with quiet authority. She explained about the cottage ownership, the suspicious will change, Mrs. Crane's affair, and Mary's apparent attempt at blackmail. She showed him the photograph of the chipped figurine and the evidence that Mrs. Crane had staged her own gift receiving. The inspector listened with growing interest. "It's plausible," he admitted, "but we need more. We need either a confession or physical evidence connecting Mrs. Crane to the actual murders. How was the poison administered? How did she gain access to the victims?" Miss Marple had been considering these questions. "I believe she used her position in the village to move freely. She's on numerous charitable committees and boards. She would have had legitimate reasons to call on each victim. As for the poison, I suspect she used something readily available, perhaps something from her garden or purchased under the guise of pest control." The inspector agreed to investigate Mrs. Crane's recent purchases and movements. He also stationed constables discreetly around her home, though without her knowledge. Miss Marple spent a sleepless night reviewing her plans. Everything depended on the confrontation the following afternoon. She needed to make Mrs. Crane reveal herself, to push her into either a confession or a betraying action. The next day dawned grey and cold, with heavy clouds promising snow. Miss Marple prepared her sitting room carefully, ensuring that Inspector Slack and his constables were positioned in adjacent rooms where they could hear everything but remain concealed. Sir Henry Clithering arrived in the morning and took up his position as well. Sarah Marsh, released from custody due to lack of evidence, had also asked to be present, driven by a desperate need to understand who had really killed her sister. Mrs. Crane arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, impeccably dressed and outwardly composed. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime reading subtle signs in human behaviour, noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes darted around the room, cataloguing exits and assessing potential threats. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Crane," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Thank you so much for coming. I believe we can finally resolve the mystery of what happened to Mary Partridge." Mrs. Crane settled into a chair, accepting tea with steady hands. "I'm not sure what more there is to resolve. Colonel Melchett confessed to everything. The case is closed." Miss Marple smiled gently. "But you see, that's what troubles me." The Colonel's confession was remarkably detailed, almost too detailed. It mentioned things that were never public knowledge, things that only the true killer would have known. She paused to sip her tea. "Things that you would have known, Mrs. Crane." The older woman's expression didn't change, but her teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "I don't know what you mean. Of course the Colonel would know details. He was involved with Mary. He killed her, and then killed the others to cover his tracks." "But he couldn't have killed them all," Miss Marple continued calmly. "You see, I have witnesses who can place him elsewhere during some of the murders. And there's the matter of the workshop in his attic, filled with taxidermy supplies and craft materials. How convenient that such evidence was discovered after his death, when he could no longer defend himself." Mrs. Crane set down her teacup with deliberate care. "You're making serious accusations, Miss Marple. Accusations you cannot possibly prove." "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple agreed, but I've been doing some research into your finances from 12 years ago. It's remarkable how wealthy you became after your husband's death, especially given that his business was struggling at the time. And then you purchased Mary Partridge's cottage for almost nothing and sold it years later for a substantial profit. So what? Mrs. Crane's voice had taken on a hard edge. I made a good investment. That's not a crime. No, but murder is, Miss Marple said quietly. I believe you killed your husband, Mrs. Crane. I believe Mary Partridge discovered evidence of that crime, perhaps the poison itself hidden in your house where she worked. I believe she tried to blackmail you, and you killed her too, making it look like suicide and using her pregnancy as the convenient explanation for everyone to accept. The room had gone very still. Mrs. Crane stared at Miss Marple with an expression that had transformed from polite attention to something much colder and more dangerous. You're quite clever, aren't you? She said softly. Too clever for your own good, some might say. That almost sounds like a threat, Miss Marple observed. But you see, I'm not alone in my conclusions. Sir Henry Clithering is here as well, and he has some questions about the original inquest that he regrets not asking at the time. Sir Henry emerged from the adjoining room, his distinguished features grave. Mrs. Crane, I believe you provided false testimony at Mary Partridge's inquest. I believe you pressured me to accept a suicide verdict to prevent a murder investigation that might have exposed your own crimes. Mrs. Crane rose from her chair, her composure finally cracking. This is absurd. You have no proof of anything. I'm leaving. But she found Inspector Slack blocking the doorway, with 2 constables behind him. Chapter 8. A confession extracted. Mrs. Crane stood frozen in Miss Marple's sitting room, her eyes darting between the inspector, Sir Henry, and Miss Marple herself. The mask of respectable propriety she had worn for so many years was beginning to slip, revealing something harder and more desperate beneath. I'm not answering any more questions without my solicitor, she said, attempting to regain control of the situation. Of course, that's your right, Inspector Slack replied, but perhaps you'd like to hear what we've discovered before making that decision. We've been conducting a thorough investigation of your property, and we found something quite interesting in your greenhouse. Mrs. Crane's face went a shade paler. You had no warrant to search my property. Actually, we did, the inspector said mildly. We obtained it yesterday based on Miss Marple's evidence. Your gardener was most helpful in showing us around. He mentioned that you've been growing wolfsbane in a restricted section of the greenhouse. Quite a lot of it, in fact. Wolfsbane, or aconite, is a deadly poison if prepared correctly. It's not illegal to grow plants, Mrs. Crane said, but her voice had lost its certainty. I'm an avid gardener. Many ornamental plants are technically poisonous. True, Miss Marple interjected gently, but your gardener also mentioned that you've been extracting oils and tinctures from various plants. He showed us your still room, where we found equipment for distillation and concentration. Most interesting were the notebooks documenting your experiments with various plant toxins, including precise notes on dosages and effects. Mrs. Crane sank back into her chair, her expression now one of calculation rather than outright denial. She was clearly weighing her options, considering what evidence they might have and what she could safely admit. Sarah Marsh, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. Did you kill my sister? Did you poison Mary because she discovered what you'd done to your husband? Mrs. Crane looked at the young woman with something almost like pity. Your sister was a foolish girl who thought she could blackmail me. She came to me with her demands, threatening to go to the police with what she'd found. A bottle of aconite tincture hidden in my private desk, correspondence with a man who wasn't my husband, forged documents related to my husband's will. She wanted money to support herself and her illegitimate child. So, you killed her, Sarah whispered. You murdered her and made it look like suicide. Mrs. Crane's expression hardened. I gave her a choice. I offered to pay her to leave the area to start fresh somewhere else, but she was greedy. She wanted more than I could afford to pay without raising suspicions. So yes, I provided her with what I told her was a tonic for her nerves, something to help her sleep and calm her distress. She took it willingly enough. Inspector Slack had been taking notes throughout this exchange. And the others? Thomas Wickham, Dr. Haydock, Harold Bassett, Geoffrey Price, and Colonel Melchett. How do they fit into your scheme? Mrs. Crane seemed to have moved beyond denial into a strange state of almost clinical detachment, as though she were discussing someone else's crimes rather than her own. When that girl, she gestured towards Sarah, started sending those ridiculous gifts, I realized the past was coming back to haunt me. People were asking questions, remembering details about Mary's death. I couldn't risk a new investigation. Too many people had been present at that Christmas party, had seen things they might not have understood at the time, but could reinterpret with hindsight. So, you decided to eliminate them, Miss Marple said, using Sarah's gift-giving pattern as cover for murder. It was actually rather brilliant in a horrible way. Everyone would assume Sarah was responsible, driven by revenge for her sister's death. Mrs. Crane gave a bitter smile. It wasn't difficult. I'm on every important committee in the village. I can go anywhere without arousing suspicion. Thomas Wickham was easy. I brought him some wine to discuss a charity event, stayed to chat while he drank it, and then helped him to his barn when he became dizzy. The geese did the rest, though he was already dying from the poison by then. And Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack asked. I visited him to discuss a fundraiser for the hospital. His office overlooks his fish pond. I suggested we walk outside to discuss the placement of tents for the event. He was already feeling unwell from the poisoned tea I'd brought. When he stumbled near the pond, I simply helped him into the water. He was too weak to resist. The clinical detachment in Mrs. Crane's voice was chilling. She described each murder with the same calm efficiency she might have used to discuss organising a church fete. Harold Bassett suspected something, she continued. He'd found irregularities in my late husband's will years ago, but had been paid handsomely to overlook them. When the murders started, he began making subtle threats suggesting he might need to share what he knew. So I visited him late one evening, ostensibly to discuss a substantial donation to his favourite charity. The poison worked quickly, and I arranged the scene to look like he'd simply fallen asleep at his desk. What about Geoffrey Price? Miss Marple asked. Why kill him? He was genuinely distraught about Mary. He wrote letters to the newspaper questioning the suicide verdict, Mrs. Crane said dismissively. He was becoming inconveniently vocal. And his supposed confession note? I typed it myself using his own typewriter when I visited, to discuss a loan for the church restoration. I knew his style of writing well enough to make it convincing. And Colonel Melchett? Sir Henry asked, his voice heavy with sadness. That seems particularly cruel, given that he was innocent. Mrs. Crane's expression flickered with something that might have been regret. He was the most dangerous because of his position. Even retired, he carried weight and authority. If he had started asking questions, people would have listened. I visited him under the pretense of seeking his advice on a legal matter. The poisoned brandy did its work quickly. I staged the suicide and planted evidence in his home to frame him posthumously. The 12th gift, the drummers, I placed there myself to make it seem like he was the next intended victim who had killed himself rather than wait for murder. Sarah Marsh had been listening with growing horror. You destroyed so many lives, she said, her voice breaking. My sister, all those other people, their families, all because you wanted to protect your reputation and your money. Mrs. Crane looked at her coldly. Your sister destroyed herself by being greedy and foolish. The others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. I did what was necessary to protect what I'd built. I won't apologize for being practical. Inspector Slack stood up, his expression grim. Mrs. Judith Crane, I'm arresting you for the murders of Mary Partridge, Thomas Wickham, Dr. Haydock, Harold Bassett, Geoffrey Price, and Colonel Melchett. You don't have to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. As the constables placed handcuffs on Mrs. Crane, she maintained her composure, though her face had gone ashen. She looked at Miss Marple as she was led toward the door. You couldn't have proved any of this without my confession. Why did I tell you everything? Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. Because you're proud of what you accomplished, even though you know it's monstrous. You spent 12 years believing you'd gotten away with the perfect crime, and when your carefully constructed world began to crumble, you couldn't resist explaining how clever you'd been. It's a common failing in murderers, I'm afraid. Pride truly does go before a fall. After Mrs. Crane had been taken away, the remaining people in the room sat in silence for a long moment. Sarah Marsh wept quietly, mourning not just for her sister, but for all the lives destroyed by one woman's ruthless practicality. Sir Henry looked older than his years, burdened by the knowledge that his failure to investigate thoroughly 12 years ago had allowed these murders to happen. Miss Marple prepared fresh tea, the familiar ritual providing comfort in the aftermath of horror. As she poured, she reflected on the nature of evil and how often it wore the mask of respectability. Mrs. Crane had been a pillar of village society, trusted and respected, while all the time she carried the weight of multiple murders on her conscience, if indeed she had a conscience at all. Chapter 9. The Unravelling Threads. The days following Mrs. Crane's arrest were difficult ones for St. Mary Mead. The village struggled to reconcile the image of the respectable, charitable Mrs. Crane with the cold-blooded murderer she had revealed herself to be. Miss Marple found herself besieged with visitors, all seeking to understand how such evil could have hidden in their midst for so long. Inspector Slack came to call on the third day after the arrest, looking exhausted but grimly satisfied. Mrs. Crane has been formally charged with 6 counts of murder. Her solicitor is trying to build a defence based on diminished capacity, but given her detailed confession and the premeditation involved, I don't think that will succeed. We've also recovered extensive evidence from her property, including poison-making equipment, detailed notes on each victim's habits and routines, and drafts of Colonel Melchit's suicide note. Miss Marple poured tea and offered him some of her housekeeper's excellent seed cake. What about her late husband's death? Will that be investigated as well? The inspector nodded. We've petitioned to have the body exhumed. Given Mrs. Crane's confession to killing him, we need to confirm the cause of death. If we can prove he was poisoned, it will strengthen the case against her and might provide closure for his children from his first marriage. They've been living all these years believing their father died naturally. Sarah Marsh had remained in St. Mary Mead, staying at a small inn while she processed everything that had happened. Miss Marple invited her to tea one afternoon, sensing the young woman needed someone to talk to who understood the complexities of the situation. Sarah arrived looking pale and drawn, the weight of the revelations clearly taking their toll. I don't know whether to feel vindicated or horrified, Sarah admitted as they sat in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room. I spent 12 years believing my sister had killed herself, feeling guilty that I hadn't been there to help her. Now I know she was murdered, but learning the truth hasn't brought the peace I thought it would. It's just revealed more horror. Miss Marple understood completely. Justice and closure are not the same thing, my dear. Justice has been served with Mrs. Crane's arrest. But closure is something you'll have to find within yourself. Your sister was a victim, not a suicide. She was trying to survive in difficult circumstances, and she encountered someone far more ruthless than she could have imagined. Sarah wiped away tears. The worst part is knowing that if I hadn't come back, if I hadn't started sending those gifts, those other people might still be alive. Mrs. Crane killed them because my actions threatened to expose her. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You mustn't think that way. Mrs. Crane made her own choices. She could have confessed 12 years ago. She could have accepted responsibility at any point. Instead, she chose to commit more murders to protect herself. The blame lies entirely with her, not with you seeking truth about your sister's death. Over the next week, more details emerged as investigators pieced together the full extent of Mrs. Crane's crimes. Her husband's body was indeed found to contain traces of aconite, confirming he had been poisoned. The children from his first marriage came forward with stories of how Mrs. Crane had systematically isolated their father from them, turning him against his own children to ensure she would inherit everything. The investigation also revealed that Mrs. Crane had been having an affair with her husband's business partner, a man named Robert Finch, who had died in a convenient accident 2 years after her husband's death. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if that death had also been murder, though there was no longer any way to prove it. The pattern of Mrs. Crane's life suggested a woman who removed obstacles without hesitation or remorse. Sir Henry Clithering called on Miss Marple before returning to London. He looked troubled, and she understood why. The weight of knowing that a more thorough investigation 12 years ago might have prevented subsequent deaths was heavy indeed. I should have pushed harder, he said, accepting the tea she offered. There were inconsistencies in the suicide verdict that bothered me, but I let Mrs. Crane's certainty and the desire to spare the family further pain override my professional judgment. Miss Marple shook her head gently. We all make decisions based on the information available at the time and the pressures we face. Mrs. Crane was skilled at manipulation and had spent years perfecting her respectable facade. She knew exactly how to play on people's desire to avoid scandal and their inclination to trust someone of her social standing. You were one of many people she deceived. Sir Henry seemed somewhat comforted by this, though Miss Marple knew he would carry the regret with him. Before he left, he paused at her door. "You have a remarkable gift, Miss Marple. The way you see through people's pretences to the truth beneath is quite extraordinary. I hope St. Mary Mead appreciates having you." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who's had time to observe human nature. I've learned that people are much the same everywhere, and the patterns of behaviour repeat themselves endlessly. Once you understand those patterns, the mysteries often solve themselves." As December progressed toward Christmas, the village slowly began to heal. The remaining gifts from the 12 days of Christmas were collected as evidence, their beautiful craftsmanship now forever associated with tragedy. Sarah Marsh arranged for proper memorial services for her sister, finally giving Mary the dignity she had been denied 12 years ago. The church service was well attended, with many villagers coming to pay respects and perhaps to assuage their own guilt for having believed the worst of Mary without question. The Reverend Clement delivered a thoughtful sermon about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath. Miss Marple attended, and found herself thinking about all the lives touched by Mrs. Crane's crimes. Mary Partridge, who had died trying to survive, Mrs. Crane's husband, who had been murdered for his money, the 6 recent victims, who had died simply because they might have remembered something inconvenient, and the many others whose lives had been forever altered by these losses, the families, friends and community members who would carry the scars forward. After the service, Sarah approached Miss Marple in the churchyard. "I've decided to leave St. Mary Mead," she said. "There are too many painful memories here, but I wanted to thank you first. You gave my sister justice and cleared her name. That means more to me than I can express." Miss Marple took the young woman's hands in her own. "Where will you go, my dear?" "Back to Switzerland, I think. I have friends there and a business I can rebuild. Maybe somewhere with fewer ghosts I can find peace." As Sarah walked away through the winter sunshine, Miss Marple felt both sadness and hope. The young woman had been through a terrible ordeal, but she had strength and resilience. Time and distance might indeed bring the healing she sought. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat by her window, watching the village go about its business, the rhythms of daily life gradually reasserting themselves despite the recent traumas. Chapter 10. Christmas arrives. Christmas Eve arrived in St. Mary Mead with a fresh blanket of snow that transformed the village into a picture of serene beauty. The events of the past week seemed almost dreamlike now, though Miss Marple knew the scars would remain long after the snow had melted. She spent the morning preparing for the evening's carol service, ensuring her warmest coat was ready and selecting a contribution for the collection that would support village charities. The trial of Mrs. Judith Crane was scheduled for the new year, though her solicitor had indicated she was likely to plead guilty to avoid the spectacle of a lengthy court proceeding. Miss Marple had been informed she would be called as a witness, along with Inspector Slack, Sir Henry Clithering, and several others who had been present for the confession. It would be an ordeal, but a necessary one to ensure justice was properly served. As she walked to the church that evening, Miss Marple encountered various neighbours, all greeting her with special warmth. Word had spread about her role in solving the murders, though she had done her best to minimise her own contributions and credit Inspector Slack's thorough investigation. Still, the villagers knew the truth. Miss Marple's keen observations and understanding of human nature had been crucial in unmasking a killer who might otherwise have continued her deadly work indefinitely. The church was beautifully decorated with holly, ivy and candles that cast a warm glow over the assembled congregation. The choir, dressed in their traditional robes, stood ready to lead the familiar carols. As the service began, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the carol that had become so darkly associated with murder, the 12 Days of Christmas. It was a song of gift-giving and celebration, twisted by Mrs. Crane into a blueprint for revenge and death. The Reverend Clement's sermon touched on themes of redemption and forgiveness, though he was careful not to mention Mrs. Crane directly. "Some acts are so terrible that forgiveness seems impossible," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed church. "Yet we must remember that evil flourishes in darkness and secrecy. When we bring it into the light, when we refuse to look away from hard truths, we diminish its power." This Christmas season has taught us painful lessons about the dangers of assumption and the importance of seeing clearly. After the service, the congregation gathered outside to share mulled wine and mince pies. Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Lady Melchett, who had remained in St. Mary Mead to clear her late husband's name and settle his affairs. The older woman looked more at peace than she had in weeks. The police have officially cleared my husband of any involvement in the murders, she told Miss Marple. They're issuing a public statement to that effect. It doesn't bring him back, but at least his memory won't be tainted by false accusations. Miss Marple expressed her sympathy and satisfaction at this outcome. Colonel Melchett had been as much a victim as the others, killed to serve as a convenient scapegoat for crimes he had never committed. His family deserved to know the truth and to mourn him without the shadow of suspicion. As she walked home through the snow, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary events that had unfolded over the 12 days leading up to Christmas. It had been one of the most complex cases she had ever encountered, involving layers of deception going back more than a decade. Mrs. Crane had been a formidable opponent, intelligent, ruthless, and skilled at maintaining a false facade for years. What had ultimately betrayed her was the same quality that had made her dangerous: her pride. She had been so confident in her own cleverness, so certain she had planned everything perfectly, that she couldn't resist explaining her methods when confronted. That pride had led her to confess to crimes that might otherwise have been difficult to prove conclusively. It was a pattern Miss Marple had observed before. Murderers often felt compelled to share their accomplishments, to ensure someone understood how brilliant they had been. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper and sat by her fire with her knitting. The needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on a new shawl, finding comfort in the familiar motion. Outside, she could hear carolers making their way through the village, their voices carrying the traditional songs of the season. When they reached her cottage, she opened the door and listened, smiling at their enthusiasm. The young voices sang of peace on earth and goodwill toward men, ideals that seemed particularly poignant after the darkness that had touched St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that darkness and light existed side by side, that human nature encompassed both great evil and great goodness. The trick was to remain vigilant, to use one's understanding of that dual nature to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. On Christmas morning, Miss Marple attended the early service and then hosted a small gathering at her cottage. Sarah Marsh had delayed her departure by one day to spend Christmas in St. Mary Mead, and she joined Miss Marple along with the vicar and his wife, Inspector Slack, and a few other close friends. It was a quiet celebration, but there was genuine warmth and fellowship among the small group. Sarah presented Miss Marple with a gift, a beautifully crafted wooden box with delicate inlay work. "I made it myself," she explained. "It's my way of saying thank you for everything you did. You gave me back my sister's memory and helped me understand what really happened. That's a gift, beyond price." Miss Marple was touched by the gesture and found the perfect spot for the box on her mantelpiece. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Sarah lingered for a final private word. "I've been thinking about what you said, about closure being something I have to find within myself. I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant. The truth doesn't erase the pain, but it does give it meaning. I can honour Mary's memory properly now, knowing she wasn't weak or cowardly. She was brave enough to stand up to a murderer, even though it cost her everything." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "Your sister would be proud of you, my dear. You persevered in seeking the truth despite all obstacles. That took considerable courage." She paused, then added gently, "And I hope you'll remember that seeking justice and seeking revenge are not the same thing. You sought justice, and that's a noble cause." After Sarah left, Miss Marple sat alone in the gathering dusk, her cottage warm and peaceful around her. She thought about all the threads that had woven together in this case, how one woman's greed and ruthlessness had created ripples of tragedy that spread across years and claimed so many lives. Mrs. Crane had believed herself invincible, protected by her social position and her carefully constructed respectability. She had counted on people's reluctance to suspect someone of her standing, their willingness to accept surface appearances rather than look deeper. But she had underestimated the power of persistence and the danger of patterns. Sarah's gift-giving campaign, intended only to disturb and perhaps force confessions, had inadvertently created a pattern that made Mrs. Crane's subsequent murders visible. Each death following each gift had been like a breadcrumb trail leading back to the person who benefited most from the victim's silence, and Mrs. Crane had underestimated Miss Marple herself, dismissing her as just another elderly village busybody, rather than recognizing the sharp intelligence and deep understanding of human nature that lay beneath the gentle exterior. The days after Christmas passed quietly. The village continued its recovery, though conversations still occasionally turned to the shocking revelations about Mrs. Crane. Some villagers expressed disbelief that someone they had known and trusted could have been capable of such horrors. Others admitted they had always found something cold about Mrs. Crane, though they had attributed it to aristocratic reserve rather than moral emptiness. Inspector Slack visited Miss Marple one afternoon in early January, bringing news that Mrs. Crane's trial date had been set. "She's maintaining her composure," he reported, settling into his usual chair. "Her solicitor says she shows no remorse whatsoever. She views the whole thing as a series of necessary business decisions that unfortunately went wrong. It's quite chilling, really. Some people lack the capacity for empathy or moral feeling," Miss Marple observed. "They see other people merely as obstacles or tools to be used in achieving their own ends." Mrs. Crane was clearly such a person. The tragedy is that she was so skilled at mimicking normal human emotions and responses that she fooled everyone for years. The inspector nodded agreement. "We've also discovered that Robert Finch, her late husband's business partner, was almost certainly another victim. We found letters suggesting he had begun to suspect Mrs. Crane of murdering her husband and was preparing to go to the authorities. He died in what was ruled an accidental fall downstairs at his home. Given what we now know, it seems far more likely that Mrs. Crane arranged his death as well. How many lives?" Miss Marple wondered aloud. One woman's greed and ruthlessness had destroyed, a husband killed for his money, a business partner eliminated as a threat, a young woman murdered for attempting blackmail, and then 6 more victims killed simply because they might remember inconvenient details from the past. It's a cascade of tragedy, each death leading inevitably to the next. The inspector departed, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles moving with practiced rhythm as she contemplated the nature of justice. Mrs. Crane would face trial, and barring some extraordinary circumstance, would spend the rest of her life in prison. That was the justice of the legal system. But what of the deeper justice, the moral accounting that transcended courts and laws? Mrs. Crane had stolen years of life from her victims, had deprived families of loved ones, had spread grief and suffering with cold calculation. No prison sentence could truly balance that scale or restore what had been lost. The best that could be hoped for was that her imprisonment would prevent further harm and serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to believe themselves above moral law. And perhaps there was some justice in the fact that Mrs. Crane's pride, the very quality that had made her feel superior to others, had been her ultimate downfall. As January progressed, life in St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its normal rhythms. The story of the 12 days of Christmas murders would become part of village lore, told and retold with various embellishments over the years. But for those who had lived through it, who had known the victims and witnessed the investigation, the memory would always carry a particular weight. Miss Marple received a letter from Sarah Marsh in late January, postmarked from Switzerland. The young woman wrote that she was settling back into her life there, finding some measure of peace in familiar surroundings and the company of old friends. She had arranged for a proper headstone for her sister's grave, with an inscription that honoured Mary's memory and acknowledged the injustice of her death. "I visit the grave when I'm in England," Sarah wrote. "It helps to have a place to go, to feel connected to the sister I lost so long ago." The letter concluded with heartfelt thanks to Miss Marple for her kindness and her determination to uncover the truth. "You changed my life, Miss Marple. You gave me back my sister's honour and helped me understand that she was a victim, not a villain. I'll carry that knowledge with me always." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She was glad that Sarah had found some peace, that the truth, however painful, had brought a measure of closure. The trial of Mrs. Judith Crane took place in March at the county assizes. Miss Marple attended as a witness, along with Inspector Slack, Sir Henry Clithering, Lady Melchett and several others. The proceedings were sombre and methodical, with the prosecution laying out a devastating case built on Mrs. Crane's own confession, physical evidence from her property, and testimony from numerous witnesses. Mrs. Crane herself showed no emotion throughout the trial, sitting erect and composed as though she were attending a particularly dull social function rather than facing judgment for multiple murders. When asked if she had anything to say in her own defence, she declined. Her solicitor's attempts to argue diminished capacity were quickly dismissed given the extensive evidence of premeditation and planning. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, in passing sentence, spoke of the calculated cruelty of Mrs. Crane's crimes and the betrayal of trust inherent in using her respected position to facilitate murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, effectively ensuring she would die in prison. As Miss Marple left the courthouse, she felt a sense of completion rather than triumph. Justice had been served, but at such a terrible cost. So many lives lost, so many families grieving, all because one woman had valued money and position above human life. It was a sobering reminder of how much damage a single person could inflict when they operated without moral constraints. Back in St. Mary Mead, the village held a memorial service for all the victims of Mrs. Crane's crimes. The church was full, with representatives from each victim's family present to remember their loved ones. The Reverend Clement spoke movingly about the importance of community, of looking out for one another, and of not allowing evil to flourish in silence and darkness. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her hands folded in her lap, her mind full of memories. She thought of Mary Partridge, the young woman whose death had set everything in motion, whose attempt to survive had cost her life. She thought of the 6 recent victims, ordinary people going about their lives until they encountered a killer's ruthless calculation. And she thought of Sarah Marsh, the determined young woman who had sought only truth and justice for her sister. As spring arrived in St. Mary Mead, bringing renewal and fresh, and growth to gardens and hedgerows, the village continued its healing. The cottage that had once belonged to Mary Partridge, that Mrs. Crane had purchased and profited from, was sold to a young couple starting their life together. The new owners knew nothing of its tragic history and filled it with laughter and hope. Miss Marple tended her roses and maintained her quiet observations of village life. She had solved another mystery, brought another killer to justice, but she took no pleasure in it. Murder was always a tragedy, a failure of human nature, a reminder that beneath the veneer of civilization lurked impulses that could lead to terrible acts. One evening in late April, as Miss Marple sat by her window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, she reflected on the lessons of the case. The 12 Days of Christmas, a carol of generosity and celebration, had been perverted into a murder weapon by someone who understood symbols and patterns, but lacked any understanding of genuine human connection or empathy. Mrs. Crane had been brilliant in her way, capable of planning and executing elaborate schemes, but she had failed to understand that intelligence without morality was ultimately self-defeating. Her pride had been her undoing, as pride so often was for murderers. The need to be recognized as clever, to have someone appreciate the intricacy of her plans, had led her to confess when silence might have saved her. Miss Marple finished her knitting for the evening and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new small mysteries to unravel in the daily life of the village. Some would be trivial, matters of gossip or minor scandal. Others might prove more serious. But whatever came, Miss Marple would be ready, her sharp eyes and sharper mind prepared to see through pretense to truth. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts were of Sarah Marsh, beginning a new life in Switzerland with the burden of her sister's memory finally at peace. The truth had not erased Sarah's pain, but it had given her the knowledge that Mary had not been weak, had not chosen death, but had fought to survive until she encountered someone more ruthless than she could have imagined. Justice had been served, the guilty punished, the innocent vindicated. The 12 Days of Christmas murders had been solved, and St. Mary Mead could rest easy once more. Miss Marple had done her part, using her gifts of observation and understanding to protect her community from a predator in their midst. It was enough. It had to be enough. And so the story concludes, as all stories must. The mystery solved, the pattern complete, the threads woven together into a coherent whole. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, life goes on, seasons turn, and Miss Jane Marple continues her gentle vigilance, watching and understanding, ready to unravel the next tangled skein of human nature that presents itself to her keen and compassionate gaze. This has been Mindful Musings, and I am William, grateful to have shared this tale with you. May we all learn from Miss Marple's example to see clearly, think carefully, and never underestimate the depths of human nature, for good or for ill. Until we meet again in another story, may your days be peaceful and your mysteries easily solved. The end.